This is a new French coming of age drama, kind of a dark drama with some comedic elements, but I think some people call this a comedy. I think that might be going a bit far, depending on your read of the film. But this was written and directed by, and I'm going to butcher this name. I apologize. I don't speak French, so I don't know how to pronounce the name accurately. But I think it's Maïmouna Doucouré or something like in that zone. So again, I apologize. She is a French Senegalese director. This is her first film, and her film stars Fatia Youssef, Medina El Aidi Azuni, Esther Guerrero, a lot of unfamiliar faces, I think, to some people out here in the West. But the movie itself, Cuties, follows an 11-year-old girl who is growing up Muslim, and she finds herself fascinated by a group of other preteens who are obsessed with dance. And she decides that she wants to get ingrained in their little clique. And she is particularly fascinated by some of the hypersexualized dancing competitions that they do. And she goes on a path essentially toward how this hypersexualization is going to potentially damage her relationships with her family, how it could take her down a pretty dark path as a young girl. Now, we have to explain some backstory with this film. It premiered at Sundance and it won an award. A lot of people were cherishing this film or celebrating this film as something that really goes after some of the ways that our culture across the world kind of puts preteens in a position where they emulate very grotesque behavior for their generation, or it sort of celebrates, like I said before, hypersexualization. And for that reason, a lot of people watched this and said, this is a very important movie. This is something that people should watch. And, it could start discussions about how much in our pop culture we're sort of like imparting onto the next generation. Unfortunately, the film, when it was bought by Netflix, had a poster that they put out, and some complete, and I hesitate to say it to this extreme, but some complete and utter moron or a series of morons decided that the poster, the marketing for this kind of movie, would feature these young girls in like dance attire in that hypersexualized nature it is criticizing. And this created a maelstrom of controversy that to me is infuriating, because a lot of people now are cherry picking clips out of this movie. People I know in my real life who don't watch movies, who never would have heard of this movie or said anything about it, are now using this as part of a campaign to somehow criticize or get into these, like we talked about global conspiracies already in this episode, but get into this global pedophilia conspiracy fueled by things like QAnon, that this film is trying to turn people into pedophiles, essentially. And it's completely false. People who've never seen this film, who don't actually know anything about it, are parroting and echoing what a bunch of agitators on the far right political spectrum are sending out simply to make people upset, simply to try to provoke a reaction out of people because they see an opportunity to stick it to Hollywood. Even though Hollywood did not make this movie, this is a film that was made in France, and this is the kind of film that's been made before. But because some bozo made a marketing poster that was completely ill-informed, we now have to deal with this. We now have to weigh this film and what it's saying against what a bunch of bad faith people are saying about it, and what some good faith people are saying because they trust those people. And so this is a bit of a minefield, and I understand we have to be really careful on how we talk about this, because it's not like this is a film without flaws. It's not like it's a film that I think we can come away saying it perfectly avoids some of the pitfalls you could assign to it in terms of how it portrays these women, but we should just get it off from the get-go. This was directed by a woman, and the intent of the film is clear if you watch it. But all of that out of the way, I'm sorry for the long preamble. I know, Abby, you saw this film. I believe you did not see this, correct?
Yeah, no, I didn't watch it.
Abby, I want to know from you, despite the controversy, or maybe because of it, or any sort of mix, I don't know how you want to approach this, but definitely just want to hear what you think of Cuties.
Yeah, it's interesting that we talked about the social dilemma and then talked about this, because I feel like there's a lot of kind of intermarriage of themes between the stuff that documentary was talking about and the way that this movie was discussed online. Largely by people who hadn't seen it, and largely based upon a marketing campaign, which for one reason or another seems to have been successful. It's on the front page of Netflix and it's in the top 10, which for French subtitled film, I would imagine is probably not a common thing for Netflix in the US. So I guess it's successful from a numbers standpoint. But from a public discourse standpoint, it's definitely been a pretty irritating thing to have to deal with for the last few days. As far as the movie itself goes, I mean, I feel like it's fairly clear in showing the negative impacts of hypersexualized popular culture and social media on young girls, especially in the particular circumstance that it's giving. There are several performance elements of it where the girls are in competition, dance competition, where they're doing these hypersexualized moves, and the response from judges and adults in the audience almost uniformly is one of disgust, which it should be. That these are people who are completely freaked out and turned off by the idea that these girls would want to behave in that way and would see that as something that would be appealing coming from an 11-year-old. I think overall, the movie is kind of looking at themes of being forced to grow up too soon and what that does to young girls. The main character, Amy, is a Senegalese immigrant who has just arrived in Paris with her mom and her two younger brothers, one who's like 4 or 5 and one who's a baby. And because she's 11, she's the oldest girl, she's kind of expected to be their surrogate mom and take care of them. And part of the way through the movie, they discover that her father has taken a second wife. He's still in Senegal. And so when he joins them in Paris, he will be bringing that second wife, which kind of throws the whole family into turmoil. And it's shortly after that she kind of becomes aware of the dance group at her school and becomes really interested in it. And it almost turns into a kind of mania in her attempt to try and fit in with these girls and kind of reject the culture that she's been part of up to that point, the culture of her family, basically. So it's a story about somebody who is kind of trying to navigate two very different cultures and is being asked to take on more mature roles in both of them than she is psychologically ready to handle. Like both from her mother, who is essentially making her be an adult before she is ready to become one. And also from these girls that she's interacting with, who she sees a lot of, I guess, ideas of liberation and freedom in because of the way that they act. But these girls are not good role models for her, and that's made pretty clear throughout. And they're also acting this way because a lot of the time they are unsupervised by their own parents, so they're kind of making up their own rules as they go along. And I feel like by the end of the film, it's become pretty obvious that what Amy, the main character, needed the whole time was to be able to have a healthy childhood, to be able to have a girlhood. And I think that it kind of comes down on the side of just there's a lot of extremes in the world, and when you impose those extremes on someone who is young and impressionable and isn't yet fully formed in their understanding of how to walk in the world that we live in, it can have some really frightening and negative effects. So a little bit like the social dilemma, we need to be careful about the way that we are interacting with and treating and expecting things from younger people, especially young girls. That's my TED Talk. Thank you for coming.
Yes, I think it's spot on. I think that it is ironic because the message of this movie, what this movie is trying to say about kids should have time to just be kids. They shouldn't be emulating these older adults and what they're doing. And there's a reason it's happening. This is what the critics of the film, who are saying that it's a negative influence, this is what they're saying about their own kids of like, I wish Netflix wouldn't do this because kids shouldn't see this sort of thing. First of all, I think this is not a movie for kids to watch. It's rated appropriately. And the point of the film is not for kids to see it and to emulate the behavior. It would be like saying The 400 Blows is a bad influence on young kids who might be getting into truancy. It's like, no, that movie was not for kids to watch. That movie and this movie, it's for parents who are, or prospective parents who are naive about what kids are going through. And I think it's instructive on how do kids get to this point where they turn into hypersexualized people way before that's appropriate, and how they can get taken advantage of and how these situations happen. I think that's where the film is most effective. I really like how you described it as a young girl trying to navigate two cultures. And I think the reason she wants this to be in this clique, she wants these friends, she wants this dance competition, is because she's escaping an oppressive family life. And I think that it's done in a very subtle but very apparent way if you're paying attention. And it really shows you how Like you said, when you put these kids and you try to make them grow up too soon, they're going to rebel. They're going to find other places where they can separate themselves more forcefully from an identity that causes them emotional trauma. And that is what's happening to this young girl. And all of the scenes where she's doing horrific things that you do not think she should be doing, it is instructive on how she got to this point. Now, all of that said, I am a little bit torn with some of the decisions the director makes here to get that point across. I think it does sort of cross the line a few times where it is so uncomfortable and it's so hard to watch. I struggle to kind of be on this film's side completely. And I think that there are people who they do take these clips out of context, but it is true that these clips are still there. And I think it is a valid concern to say, even in a film that is for adults to watch, is it sort of indirectly promoting an image that should not be out there? And I do wrestle with that a bit. I think that that is a fair and a valid concern that people will have. Now, at the same time, I don't think that it would be made as big of a deal of in any other situation, if only because of how Netflix mishandled this entire thing. I should say Netflix's marketing or whoever was behind all of this. But at the end of it, I would say that I wish people would have more of that good faith conversation about how far this film takes it. It makes me sad to admit that I think that down the line, I could see people looking at this film as tame compared to what is going to come out in the future unrelated to this. And I think that is worth pointing out as well. But yeah, again, I'm a little bit torn, but I mean, yeah, where did you fall on that, Abby, in terms of getting through this movie and being able to sort of endure some of those more troubling scenes?
Yeah, there is some stuff in the film that is kind of genuinely surprising that it happens as fast as it does, and that it happens that there are some elements of it that are fairly jarring. There's nothing I don't think that we see that's explicit, but the stuff that's implied is pretty intense. And I would say that not all of that feels fully accurate to, at least, well, to my own experience, which is fairly limited. And that may be different. But yeah, there are some things in there that I think a lot of viewers would have trouble kind of logically being on board with. I think it does try to communicate that Amy, the main character, is so desperate to escape one form of adulthood and enter another that she kind of loses all boundaries and sense of propriety, which goes to some pretty extreme spots. I do think it makes her a little less believable as a character, and I feel like that's kind of a flaw of the film.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But yeah, but I do like the idea that it's trying to convey, even if it does kind of come off as a little more extreme than it should.
Yeah, I'm not so getting into our final grades. I'm not sure if I'm a lot lower than you or maybe we're closer, but I'd say that I'm like a solid B- on this because in addition to what you said about the main character not really being believable, despite a really great performance, I think Fatia Youssef is really good in this, and she really commits to the role, and she deserves to be commended, especially for her young age. I do think, and on top of that, I think the movie is a bit slow. I think it takes a little too long. You kind of said that it was rushed, and that's true in terms of like how her character sort of develops. But I think there are some padded scenes here that aren't as necessary, at least in my view. You might disagree because they might inform kind of what you're talking about in terms of like really showing her traumatic life, pushing her into this new life. But for me, I thought that this could have been streamlined a little bit more because ultimately it goes to an ending that is satisfactory in the sense that it gets its point across, I think, in the best way it can, where it's turning what would otherwise be a whiplash moment into a whiplash the movie into a whiplash emotional kind of feeling. And that's where I think the film, it does come together. It does get to the point I think it needs to get to. But I think because it's so extremely uncomfortable along the way, I'm pretty torn on this film. But I'm still up for telling people that depending on where you're at cinematically, this might be worth a watch, just in the sense of because of some of its filmmaking and because of these performances and what this is saying about culture in a way that is helpful, I think, like I said, for adults who, again, are pretty naive about the life of teenagers, specifically preteens. It gets into what we were talking about with Social Dilemma, where anxiety and depression, it's happening because of certain ways that social media is being mishandled and onto the next generation, or how the next generation is suffering from certain trends. And I use that term in both meanings. So yeah, mid B- for me. What about you?
Yeah, John, I'd say we're probably around the same spot. I would give this a B- as well, for a lot of the same reasons. I think I believe it's this filmmaker's first movie. Is that right?
Yes, this is her directorial debut, and I'm not sure what else she's worked on, to be honest.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say it's a strong first outing, but it does feel like a first film in terms of it having a message that it wants to get across very strongly and sometimes to the detriment of the storytelling. But I do think it's a message worth considering, and I do think it's a perspective that is fairly unique and can potentially open up some good space for conversation that I think is worth having, kind of like I said with Social Dilemma. But yeah, I'd say we're about the same. I'd give it a B-.
All right. We did it, Abby. We reviewed the very difficult to review movie. Great job. All right.
Hooray. Yay.
That was a tough one.